Imagine, if you will, walking down a single, seemingly normal street in a European city. I mean, it's not a grand sweeping boulevard or anything like that.
Right, it's relatively short, right? Maybe about 300 meters from end to end.
Yeah, exactly. Just a quick walk, you look around and see the standard modern urban scenery. But on this brief, casual walk, you are quite literally stepping over the ghosts of ancient Roman merchants.
Oh, absolutely. You're tracing the physical remnants of a Byzantine emperor's legacy.
Right, and you're walking right through the echo of this devastating, highly coordinated anarchist bombing. And incredibly, you are treading directly above soil that, until very recently, hid dozens of buried, unexploded artillery shells from World War II.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is, and all of this is happening while the delicate, live sound of classical music wafts out into the air from the central glass atrium of a beautifully restored 19th century mansion just down the block. I mean, this isn't a chaotic movie set. It's a real street you can go visit today.
It really forces you to rethink what a city actually is, We interact with cities as if they're these finished products, just static grids of asphalt and concrete.
Yeah, like they've always just been there.
Exactly. But they're living, breathing organisms that constantly overwrite themselves. The history doesn't go anywhere. It just gets violently or sometimes quietly compacted down into the dirt.
I love that idea of history being compacted, and this entire realization comes from an incredible project sent to us by a podcaster in Greece named Giannis Stefanidis.
It's a fantastic project.
It really is. His initiative is called The Street Has Its Own Story, or in Greek, O dromos echi historia.
Wow.
And he provided us with this absolute mountain of research focused entirely on this one single stretch of pavement in the heart of Thessaloniki, Greece.
Right, Leontos Sofou Street.
Yeah, Leontos Sofou.
And the sources he compiled for this deep dive are phenomenal because they allow us to use a micro lens to view a macro history. I mean, we are pulling from detailed urban exploration articles by Parallaxy magazine.
They do great work.
They do. And we've got comprehensive architectural databases like Thess Architecture, deep historical archives, and photographic evidence from Saloni.ca, and even digital applications from the Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki.
It's a wealth of material.
It really is. By isolating just this one street, we can see how massive geopolitical shifts, wars, and economic booms actually affected the regular people standing on the corner.
It reminds me of a geological core sample.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Like when scientists take a long metal tube and drill deep into a glacier, they pull up this cylinder of ice where every single era of the planet's climate is preserved in these visible layers.
Right.
Giannis's research essentially takes a core sample of Leontos Sofou. If you drill down through the modern pavement, you hit every single era of Thessaloniki's past. But to start making sense of it, I think we need to look up at the blue street signs.
Definitely. The namesake is crucial here.
Right. So the street was renamed Leontos Sofou in 1914, right after the city was incorporated into the modern Greek state, and they were, trying to shed the old Ottoman names. So who exactly is Leontos Sofou?
Well, Leontos Sofou translates to Leo the Wise. And to understand him, we have to rewind the clock over a millennium to the Byzantine Empire.
Wow. Okay, going way back.
Way back. We were talking about Emperor Leo VI, who ruled from the year 886 to 912. He was a highly prominent member of the Macedonian dynasty, but he was a very unconventional ruler for that era.
How so?
Well, he wasn't a battlefield commander or like a sword-wielding conqueror. He was a scholar.
Wait, an academic sitting on an imperial throne? That feels rare.
Extremely rare, but he was basically raised to be one. His tutor was Photios, who is widely considered one of the most brilliant scholars and patriarchs of the entire Byzantine era.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so under that kind of tutelage, Leo became a wildly prolific writer. The sheer variety of his output is staggering. He wrote a deeply emotional funeral oration for his father, Bezai. He composed complex religious hymns, some of which are actually still sung in the Orthodox Church today, particularly during the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross.
Wait, he's writing religious poetry while actively running an empire?
Yep, and he didn't stop there. He also wrote a massive, highly technical military manual called the Taktika.
A military manual?
Yeah, and this wasn't just philosophical musing. It detailed infantry formations, naval strategies, siege tactics. He synthesized centuries of Roman and Byzantine military knowledge, despite rarely seeing the front line himself.
That is a wild resume. I mean, poetry, military strategy, running the empire. But the sources point out that his poetry and his military manuals aren't why he earned the title of the Wise.
No, they aren't.
His real legacy, the thing that actually changed the day-to-day lives of millions of people, was his obsession with the law.
His legal overhaul is definitely his defining achievement. Leo took on this colossal project that his father had started but couldn't finish. He created what is known as the Basilica, or the imperial laws.
Okay, so a new law code.
Exactly. And to grasp why this was so revolutionary, you have to look at the legal system he inherited. Up until Leo, the Byzantine Empire was still trying to use the corpus juris civilis.
That's the old Roman law compiled by Justinian centuries earlier, right?
Correct. And it was an absolute mess.
Really? I always thought Justinian's code was this big, celebrated achievement.
It was at the time. But by the time Leo took power, Justinian's code was hundreds of years old. And crucially, it was written in Latin.
Well, the working language of the Byzantine state was Greek.
Exactly. So imagine trying to run a vast empire where the foundational legal text is in a language most of your judges and administrators don't fluently read anymore.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was. Plus, the old code was filled with laws governing ancient Roman institutions that simply didn't exist in the 9th century, like things related to the Roman Senate or outdated pagan customs.
So the empire is essentially running on a legacy operating system that is full of obsolete code, bugs, and contradictory rules, written in a programming language no one uses anymore.
That is a brilliant way to look at it, actually. Leo effectively sat down and debugged the empire. The Basilica was a massive 60-book compilation.
60 books? Wow.
He had his scholars translate the relevant laws into Greek. He threw out the obsolete laws. He organized the remaining rulings logically by subject matter so judges could actually reference them quickly.
So he made it searchable, basically.
Right. He streamlined the entire concept of Byzantine governance.
And he didn't just stop at the broad imperial laws either. The research Giannis provided mentioned something called the Book of the Eparch.
Oh, the Book of the Eparch shows his absolute obsession with micromanagement.
Mm-hmm.
The Eparch was essentially the mayor or governor of Constantinople.
Okay.
And this book was a highly detailed regulatory manual for the city's guilds, the silk weavers, the perfume makers, the butchers.
Down to the butchers, really.
Down to the butchers. It dictated exactly how tradesmen could operate, where they could set up their stalls, how much profit they were allowed to make, and the strict penalties for hoarding goods or price gouging.
So he wanted total control.
He wanted a society where everything, from the grandest imperial succession to the price of a loaf of bread, was perfectly ordered and codified.
Which makes the second half of his biography so fascinating.
It's quite the contrast.
It really is, because you read all of this and he sounds like the ultimate hyper-rational administrator, everything in its right place. But then you look at his personal life, and it is a complete chaotic disaster.
Total disaster.
He breaks the biggest, most sacred rule in his own society.
The irony is profound. I mean, the man who codified the law for the empire created the biggest legal and religious crisis of his era. And it all stemmed from the most basic requirement of a monarch.
Securing a legitimate male heir.
Exactly. He needed a son to continue the Macedonian dynasty.
So how bad did it get?
Well, it started poorly and only got worse. His father, Basil, forced Leo into an arranged marriage with a noblewoman named Theophano Martiniaki. Leo apparently despised the arrangement. Yeah. They had a daughter, but no son. Theophano eventually retreated to a monastery and passed away. Leo, now free, quickly married his longtime mistress, Zoe Zaudzena.
Okay, so marriage number 2?
Right. And by all accounts, this was a genuine love match. But tragically, in the year 899, Zoe died from an illness. And again, no male heir survived.
Okay, so he's a 2-time widower. The clock is ticking. The empire needs an heir. I'm guessing he tries again.
He does. He marries for a 3rd time. The new empress is Eudokia Bayon. The empire breathes a sigh of relief because she quickly becomes pregnant.
Oh, good.
But in 901, disaster strikes again. Eudokia dies during childbirth, and the infant boy perishes a few days later.
Oh, man. 3 wives dead, still no son. And this is where he hits a massive wall with the Orthodox Church, doesn't he?
A seemingly insurmountable wall. The Byzantine Church at that time had incredibly strict views on marriage. The first marriage was considered sacred. A second marriage was frowned upon, but tolerated, due to human frailty. A third marriage was considered a severe canonical violation. It was practically pushing the absolute limits of the faith.
But a 4th marriage?
A 4th marriage was explicitly condemned. It was viewed as an obscenity. It was akin to serial adultery in their eyes.
But he's the emperor. He needs a son to prevent a civil war over succession, right? He can't just give up.
A pressure was immense. So Leo takes a mistress named Zoe Karapanagioti. In the year 905, she finally gives birth to a healthy boy,
Finally.
the future Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus. Leo finally has his heir,
Right.
but there is a glaring issue. Because they are not married, the boy is illegitimate and cannot inherit the throne.
Oh, no. So he has a son, but it doesn't count legally.
Exactly. So to legitimize his son, Leo decides he simply must marry Zoe. This triggers the famous tetragamy scandal, the crisis of the fourth marriage.
The ultimate lawmaker deciding that the rules don't apply to him when the stakes are high enough? How does the church react to that?
The Patriarch of Constantinople, Nicholas Mystikos, draws a hard line. He absolutely refuses to recognize the marriage.
He just says no to the emperor.
Flat out no. He refuses to crown Zoe as empress. He goes so far as to physically bar Emperor Leo from entering the Hagia Sophia for Christmas Mass.
Wait, really? He locked him out?
He locked him out. It was a massive public standoff between the state and the church.
You don't just lock the emperor out of his own cathedral without consequences.
No, you don't. Leo leveraged every ounce of his political power. He reached out to the Pope in Rome to find a loophole, essentially playing the Eastern and Western churches against each other.
Clever.
Eventually, Leo uses his imperial authority to just depose Nicholas Mystikos. He forcibly removes him from power and installs a more compliant patriarch, Euthymos.
Let me guess. Euthymos is fine with the marriage.
Conveniently, yes. He ultimately grants a dispensation for the fourth marriage. The boy is legitimized, the dynasty is saved, but it causes a bitter schism within the Byzantine church that lasted for decades.
It is wild that a street in the modern era is named after a guy whose life was this much of a paradox. I mean, he creates the ultimate system of order, but brings total chaos to his personal life.
It's a great observation.
And if we look at the physical street of Leontos Sofou, it mirrors that same tension perfectly. It started as a symbol of absolute order, and then history just kept throwing chaos at it.
The geographical evolution of the street tells that exact story. If we go back long before it was named after Leo, this space was a Roman cardo.
Let's break that down for a second, because we see that term in a lot of European history. What makes a street a cardo?
When the ancient Romans planned a city, or, say, a military camp, they didn't just build roads organically wherever people happened to walk.
Right, they loved their grids.
They imposed a strict, highly rational grid. The primary horizontal axis running east to west was called the decumanus. The primary vertical axis running north to south was the cardo.
Okay, so it's the vertical line.
Yes. Leontos Sofou was a cardo. It was a perfectly straight, vertical 700-meter line that connected the upper residential neighborhoods directly down to the bustling port.
So it was designed from its very conception to be an artery of movement, just funneling goods and people straight to the water.
It was the commercial spine of the ancient city, and it held that 700-meter vertical shape for centuries. Fast forward to the Ottoman era, the city's demographics and language completely change, and the street becomes known as Yilan Mermer.
Marble of the Snake. I mean, that sounds like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. Where does a name like that even come from on a commercial street?
It came from a very specific, imposing physical landmark. At the top of the street, there was a square that housed a massive ancient column.
Like a Roman column.
Yeah, it was likely the base of an old Roman emperor statue that had long since crumbled or been removed. But the giant marble base stubbornly remained there for centuries.
And the snake part.
Well, in urban environments, when you have an ancient ruin standing in the middle of a modern neighborhood, folklore naturally grows around it. The local legends associated this specific marble column with snakes.
Huh.
Perhaps due to carvings on it, or maybe just the fact that actual reptiles sun themselves on the warm stone during the day.
The sources outline something else fascinating about the street during the Ottoman period. It wasn't just a road. It functioned almost like a geopolitical border within the city itself.
It was a very distinct dividing line. If you think of Ignatia Street as the equator cutting horizontally across Thessaloniki, Leontos Sofou crossed right over it.
Like a crosshair.
Exactly. The top half of Leontos Sofou, above Ignatia, ran up the hill into traditional, quiet Muslim residential neighborhoods. The anchor of that upper section was the Yusuf Pasha Mosque. The architecture was different. The pace of life was slower.
But then you walk south, you cross Ignatia, and head toward the port.
The moment you crossed that intersection, the atmosphere inverted completely. The bottom half of the street plunged directly into the Jewish quarter, specifically an area known as the Franco-Mahallas.
Let's clarify that term because it sounds contradictory. Why is a Jewish quarter called the Franco-Mahallas? Doesn't Frank refer to Western Europeans?
It does, and it really highlights how cosmopolitan Thessaloniki was at the time. In the Ottoman Empire, all Western Europeans, whether they were French, Italian, British, were colloquially referred to as Franks.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this specific neighborhood near the port was where the Catholic missions, the European consulates, and the foreign banks were established. Over time, the affluent Jewish commercial bourgeoisie of Thessaloniki, who did massive amounts of trade with these Western European nations, concentrated their businesses and homes in this exact district.
Ah, I see.
So the Franco-Mahalas became the European-facing, highly cosmopolitan, hyper-commercial heart of the city. You could walk down this 700-meter street and traverse completely different linguistic, religious, and economic universes.
That is incredible. But if you go to Thessaloniki today and look for this massive 700-meter cultural bridge, you won't find it. The street is much shorter now.
It was drastically altered by one of the most traumatic events in the city's history, the Great Fire of 1917.
That fire changed everything.
It really did. A massive portion of the historical center, including almost the entire commercial district and the Franco-Mahalas, burned completely to the ground. In the aftermath, the Greek government saw an opportunity to modernize. They brought in a famous French architect and urban planner, Ernest Hébrard, to completely redesign the city.
So what was Hébrard's philosophy for the redesign?
Hébrard wanted to erase the chaotic, winding, organic layout of the Ottoman city. He wanted to replace it with a highly rational Parisian-style grid with wide boulevards, diagonal avenues, and strict zoning.
Oh, so he wanted to make it look like Paris.
Basically. And in executing this new master plan, the ancient Roman cardo of Leontos Sofou was essentially chopped up. Other newly designed avenues took precedence. What was once a 700-meter mega artery was shrunk down to the roughly 300-meter stretch we see today.
Just running from Olympia Diamanti Street up to Ignatia.
Right, exactly. It became a much smaller fragment of its former self.
While Hébrard changed the visual layout of the street, the sources provided by Giannis Stefanidis gave me something I was not expecting at all. They document what they call the acoustic anatomy of the street.
It's such a cool concept.
It's one thing to read about old buildings, but the sources actually describe what the street sounded and smelled like in the late 19th century, before the fire.
It was a full century assault. If you were standing on Leontos Sofou in the 1890s, it was the definition of industrial and commercial chaos.
Paint a picture for us.
Well, the street was packed with some of the most luxurious hotels in the Balkans, like the Hotel d'Orient and the Hotel Colombo. These places hosted diplomats, wealthy merchants, and spies.
But luxury in the 1890s didn't sound like luxury today.
Not at all. High-end travel meant horse-drawn carriages. Dozens of carriages would be lined up outside these hotels, jockeying for position.
So lots of noise.
So much noise. You had the deafening, sharp clatter of iron-shod hooves and wooden wheels slamming against uneven cobblestones. You had the shouting of the carriage drivers, and inevitably, because of the high concentration of horses, the street was heavily coated in manure.
Add that to the fact that modern plumbing wasn't exactly widespread yet.
Yeah, the sanitation was rudimentary at best. The luxury hotels relied on massive, open cesspools. The sources note that these cesspools were often emptied right in the middle of the day.
Ugh, gross.
The stench mingling with the horse manure and the sea breeze from the nearby port was staggeringly intense.
So you have the smell of raw sewage, the screaming of drivers, the clanking of carriages, and this is also a media hub, isn't it?
A very loud one. The street was a center for printing and journalism. Inside an old, sprawling Ottoman commercial complex called the Bosnak Han, which sat right on Leontos Sofou, you had the headquarters of the famous newspaper Pharos Testis Macedonias, the lighthouse of Macedonia.
Okay, so lots of journalists running around.
And heavy machinery. They operated massive, heavy industrial printing presses. So beneath the sound of the horses, you had the rhythmic, metallic, earth-shaking thud of industrial machinery churning out the daily news.
I want to pause on that image for a second. If you were standing on the corner of Leontos Sofou and Fragcon Street in 1896, you were covering your nose, you can barely hear yourself think over the printing presses and the horses. But what if you stand on that exact same coordinate today, in 2026?
The contrast is beautiful. Today, if you stand on that corner, the carriages are long gone. And the heavy industry moved to the outskirts of the city decades ago. Instead, that specific corner is now home to the State Conservatory of Music.
Wow, what a shift.
If you close your eyes now, you are surrounded by the sound of violins tuning, pianos playing complex sonatas, and operatic vocal exercises drifting out of the open windows. The sensory experience of the street flipped from harsh industrial grit to high artistic culture.
It's a wonderful evolution. But there is a very dark chapter we have to cover because the sounds of pianos and printing presses are easily drowned out by the most prominent sound in the street's history. When I was reading through the Parallaxy magazine articles, they refer to Leontos Sofou as the street that loved gunpowder.
It is a grim nickname, but unfortunately, it is historically accurate. For reasons that seem almost supernaturally coincidental, this specific stretch of land has acted as a magnet for high explosives. The most infamous event, without question, occurred on April 29, 1903.
This is the attack by the Jamitsides, right? Who were they?
The Jamitsides, often translated as the Boatmen of Thessaloniki, were a group of young, highly educated, fiercely radical Bulgarian anarchists.
What were they fighting for?
This was during the Macedonian struggle, a period of intense, bloody conflict over who would control the region as the Ottoman Empire slowly collapsed. These young men believed that standard political negotiation was completely useless.
So they turned to violence.
Their strategy was extreme, asymmetrical warfare. They wanted to execute spectacular, devastating terrorist attacks against Western-owned infrastructure within the Ottoman Empire.
What was the logic there? Why attack Western infrastructure if your enemy is the Ottoman government?
They believed that if they destroyed European capital banks, ships, utility grids, the great powers of Europe, like France and Britain, would be financially forced to intervene in the region and strip control away from the Ottomans.
Forced intervention.
Exactly. And their prime target for this strategy was sitting right on Leontos Sofou Street, the Imperial Ottoman Bank.
The scale of what they attempted, I mean, it reads like the script of an elaborate heist movie. They didn't just walk up and throw a stick of dynamite. The logistics are terrifying. How did these guys in their early 20s manage to blow up a heavily guarded imperial bank?
It required years of agonizing, patient underground labor. In 1900, 3 years before the attack, the anarchists quietly rented a small barbershop right on the street to use as a front.
A barbershop?
Yeah, and beneath the floorboards, they started digging a secret tunnel aimed at the bank. But they ran into structural issues and had to abandon it. They didn't give up, though. Later, they rented a grocery store located at the corner of Leontos Sofou and a tiny dead-end alley called Akrados.
Okay, so they moved to a grocery store.
Right. This shop was situated slightly up the street and across from the bank.
Wait, they are trying to dig a tunnel under a busy commercial street full of horses and pedestrians right under the noses of the Ottoman police. How do you hide the excavation?
That was the most psychologically taxing part of the operation. They dug a network of 2 communicating tunnels right beneath the cobblestones, shoring up the dirt as they went, heading straight for the deep foundations of the bank.
But where does all the dirt go?
Well, every bucket of dirt they dug out had to be hidden. They couldn't just dump it in the alley. So they mixed the excavated soil into bags and barrels that looked like regular grocery shipments.
That is insane.
They would casually load these heavy barrels onto carts and move them out of the city, maintaining the perfect illusion of a functioning grocery store.
The anxiety of that is hard to fathom. Sitting in a dark, cramped, suffocating dirt tunnel, hearing the rumble of heavy carriages right above your head, knowing that if the roof caves in, you're dead. And if the police look too closely at your grocery bags, you're dead. And they did this for months, slowly packing the foundations with explosives. When they finally triggered it, what happened?
The detonation was apocalyptic. It wasn't just a localized blast. The explosion completely shattered the structural integrity of the Imperial Ottoman Bank. The majority of the massive building collapsed in on itself, leaving only a skeletal portion of the front facade standing. The shockwave was so violent that it ripped through the shared walls and completely collapsed the neighboring German club, known as the Kegel Club. The luxury Hotel Colombo, located nearby, sustained severe structural damage.
The human cost must have been staggering.
It was. The streets were instantly filled with choking dust, rubble, and screaming. In the immediate blast and the chaotic violence that erupted in the city afterward, roughly 50 people died. It was a deep psychological trauma for Thessaloniki. It shattered the illusion of safety in the cosmopolitan center.
You would think that after an underground terrorist bombing, the street had seen its share of violence. But a little over a decade later, the explosives came back. Only this time, they came from above.
We moved to 1916, right in the thick of World War I. Thessaloniki is a massive logistical base for the Allied forces. The German military decides to strike the city from the air using a massive Zeppelin airship.
Dropping bombs from a giant floating hydrogen balloon in the middle of the night. That is terrifying.
Exactly. The Zeppelin's primary targets were the heavily fortified Allied ships docked on the port and the administrative military headquarters.
But they missed.
Early aerial bombardment was wildly inaccurate. Navigating a massive airship in the dark, under fire, meant they often missed their marks completely. The Zeppelin dropped its payload, missed the port facilities, and the bombs plummeted straight into the upper residential section of Leontos Sofou Street, near the Yusuf Pasha Mosque.
So the very street that was hollowed out by dynamite in 1903 is having its roofs blown in by aerial bombs in 1916.
3 civilians were killed in that Zeppelin strike, and multiple homes were destroyed. The street was quite literally caught in the crossfire of the 20th century.
And this brings us to the most surreal detail in the entire deep dive. After the WWII bombing, the city rebuilds. Then comes WWII, more bombings, more rebuilding. The street gets paved over, modern buildings go up, people go about their lives. And then we arrive at September 2022, just a couple of years ago.
It is a genuinely staggering discovery that perfectly illustrates our point about the layers of history. In the fall of 2022, a construction company was excavating an empty lot located at Leontos Sofou No. 9. They were preparing to pour the deep concrete foundations for a brand new, modern 9-story hotel.
I want to pinpoint this address, number 9 Leontos Sofou. Where is that in relation to the history we just talked about?
It is mere meters away from where the anarchists' grocery store stood in 1903. It is the exact epicenter of the street's historical violence.
So the excavators are digging down into the soil, expecting maybe to hit some old Roman pipes or Byzantine pottery, which is standard for Thessaloniki. What did the excavator buckets actually scrape against?
They hit solid rusted metal. They had unearthed a buried, fully intact arsenal of World War II artillery shells.
Oh my God.
The construction site was immediately halted. The Greek authorities and the Army bomb squad were called in. They cordoned off the modern commercial street, and over a painstaking extraction process, they removed around 70 unexploded artillery shells from that single patch of dirt.
70 highly explosive artillery shells. The irony is almost too heavy to process. This specific piece of real estate has a literal muscle memory for gunpowder.
It really does.
I mean, in 1903, men are digging through this soil to plant dynamite. In 1944, a building on this site is pulverized by Allied bombing during the German occupation. And for nearly 80 years, a massive cache of explosive ordnance just sits there, sleeping silently under the dirt. Think about what was happening above those shells for 80 years.
Just daily life.
Yeah, people parked their cars there. University students walked by on their way to class. People drank coffee just yards away.
It forces a profound realization about ancient, heavily contested cities. We build our sleek, modern, bustling lives literally on top of the dormant weapons of past wars. The ground beneath the pavement isn't just inert dirt. It is a highly volatile repository of unresolved history.
It really makes you tread a little lighter. But despite all of this destruction, the terrorism, the aerial bombardments, the Great Fire of 1917 Leontos Sofou didn't remain a crater. The people of Thessaloniki rebuilt it. And they didn't just patch it up, they transformed it into one of the most visually stunning architectural corridors in the city. The sources highlight some incredible master architects who worked on this street.
The architectural heritage here is a masterclass in resilience, primarily showcasing the brilliance of the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s. But any discussion of the street's architecture has to start with the ultimate survivor. The Ottoman Bank building, which we mentioned, is now the State Conservatory.
The biography of this single building could be a novel. It didn't even start out as a bank, did it?
No, it started as an expression of immense private wealth. It was originally built in 1840 as a lavish private mansion for a man named Jake Abbott. He was an incredibly wealthy English Levantine merchant who essentially lived like royalty in Thessaloniki.
Oh, nice.
But Abbott lived far beyond his means, ultimately squandered his fortune, and went catastrophically bankrupt. To liquidate his assets, the mansion was sold in 1873 to the Imperial Ottoman Bank, who wanted a grand headquarters for their Thessaloniki branch.
And to make it look like a proper imperial financial institution, they brought in the heavy hitters of architecture.
In 1890, the bank commissioned 2 prominent engineers, Baruch and Amar, to completely redesign and expand the former mansion. They gave it a sense of severe, imposing institutional weight.
Which lasted right up until the young anarchists tunneled under it in 1903 and blew it to pieces.
Precisely. But remarkably, after the dust settled, the bank hired Baruch and Amar again to rebuild it from the rubble.
Wow, back to work.
They managed to salvage the original grand facade facing Fragcon Street, and they reconstructed the rest of the massive structure. Decades later, in the 1920s, other famous architects of the city, like Joseph Pleiber and Eli Modiano, added their own refinements.
If I am walking past this building today on my way to get a coffee, what am I actually looking at? The sources use the term eclecticism. What does that mean in physical reality?
Eclecticism in architecture means the designers weren't tied to one single historical rulebook. They picked and chose the best, most dramatic elements from different eras and combined them to project power and culture.
So a mix and match of styles.
Exactly. In the case of the conservatory, it has very strong neo-Baroque and French chateau influences. You see highly ornate stonework, curved lines, and a sense of theatricality. If you step through the main doors, the absolute centerpiece is a magnificent central atrium.
Oh, I saw pictures of that in the research.
It is stunning. It is covered by a towering vaulted glass roof, which allows soft, natural sunlight to flood the entire interior courtyard. It feels more like a palace in Paris than a bank.
And there are a couple of original residents still standing in that courtyard, aren't there?
Yes. Tucked into the courtyard, you can find two original statues that Jake Abbott commissioned way back in the 1840s. One statue represents economy, and the other represents bank credit.
That's amazing.
They're widely considered some of the oldest civic statues in the city. They stood there through Abbott's bankruptcy, through the 1903 dynamite blast, through the 1917 fire, and the WWII bombings. They are the ultimate survivors.
It's an incredible anchor for the street. But as the city rebuilt after the 1917 fire, the commercial buildings that rose up were just as ambitious. The sources heavily highlight an architect named George Manousos.
George Manousos was a visionary who essentially helped draft the visual language of interwar Thessaloniki. He was a highly prolific architect who graduated from the prestigious Fine Arts School in Constantinople in 1905.
So he knew what he was doing.
Absolutely. He understood how to blend commercial function with high elegance. On Leontos Sofou, his absolute masterpiece is the Stoa Karapanagioti, which he designed in 1925.
I was looking at the photos from Saloni.ca in the research, and the Stoa Karapanagioti is breathtaking. But there is a very heavy, tragic aura around it.
It is a beautiful tragedy. The building sits on the corner of Phragon and Leontos Sofou, built on the exact footprint where the old, noisy Ottoman Bosnak Khan used to be. Manousos designed it as a pure commercial arcade.
Like a mall of the 1920s.
Basically. But he didn't design a boring, boxy warehouse. He gave it elegant, sweeping, curved corners breaking away from rigid geometry. It features tall, perfectly symmetrical windows with decorative glass transoms above them.
It sounds so classy.
It is. It has delicate little balconies with intricate wrought iron railings supported by ornate stone corbels. You can see clear hints of Art Deco geometry blending flawlessly with classical proportions.
And if you try to visit it today, you can't get in.
No. Unlike the State Conservatory, which is glowing with life, the Stoa Karapanagioti is dead. It has not been restored.
That's such a shame.
As the wholesale textile market, which used to be the lifeblood of this specific neighborhood, slowly declined and collapsed in the 1990s, the shops inside the arcade shuttered one by one. Today, the property belongs to the Red Cross.
Really? The Red Cross owns it?
Yeah. It is officially listed by the state as a protected historical monument, but it sits completely abandoned. The beautiful wooden doors are sealed shut with padlocks. The windows are dusty. It is a sleeping beauty, frozen in time, waiting for an economic miracle to wake it up.
There is another giant of interwar architecture who left his mark on the street, Max Rubens.
Max Rubens was a profoundly important figure. He was a prominent Jewish architect and a vital member of the city's vibrant Jewish community prior to the devastation of the Holocaust. He was incredibly active in redesigning the fire zone, the massive swaths of the city that had to be rebuilt from scratch after 1917.
So he was busy.
Very. In 1928, he designed a fascinating commercial building at the intersection of Valority 13 and Leontos Sofou 15.
The story behind this building really shows the tension between artistic vision and cold, hard cash.
It really does. Rubens' original blueprints from 1925 called for a highly ambitious, opulent structure. He wanted a grand corner tower and a sweeping French mansard roof. It would have dominated the skyline of the street.
But then reality hit.
But reality, specifically the construction budget, hit hard. The cost of his original vision was simply too high for the developers. So Rubens, proving he was a pragmatist as well as an artist, went back to the drawing board. He redesigned the building into a more streamlined, highly functional, but still incredibly elegant structure.
And that building went on to host a very famous piece of local culture, right?
Yes. For decades, the ground floor of Rubens' building housed the legendary American market.
The American market. What was that?
This is a famous local bazaar where residents of Thessaloniki could buy high-quality secondhand clothes that were imported in massive bales directly from the United States. It was an absolute staple of the city's commercial life. Rubens also designed the beautiful Hotel Historia just down the street in 1925, further cementing his legacy on this single block.
We've talked about banks, arcades, and hotels, but we can't talk about the architecture of northern Greece in the early 20th century without talking about tobacco. The street was a hub for the tobacco industry, which was an absolute economic juggernaut at the time.
The tobacco wealth built a lot of the modern city. On Leontos Sofou, the Stoa Alamani, is a perfect example of this legacy. It was actually built a bit later, in the 1950s, but it strictly follows the architectural tradition of the much older interwar tobacco warehouses.
When you look at these tobacco warehouses, they look very distinct. They don't look like normal office buildings.
What is fascinating about them is that their architecture was dictated entirely by the biological needs of a plant. From the street level, they look like imposing fortresses. They have very rhythmic, repetitive, relatively small windows on the lower floors.
But the top floor is different.
If you look up at the top floor, the roof line is always noticeably higher and is filled with large, specialized, angled skylights.
Why only on the top floor?
Because the final, most delicate stage of processing and sorting the sensitive tobacco leaves required abundant, natural, evenly distributed sunlight. If the light was too harsh or too dim, the workers couldn't accurately judge the color and quality of the leaf.
And that dictated the price.
Exactly. So the architects designed these massive industrial fortresses solely to funnel the perfect type of sunlight onto the top floor work tables.
That makes me think about a question that always bothers me when I walk down heavily historical streets. We have these absolute masterpieces standing shoulder to shoulder. You look to your left, and there's the State Conservatory, a gorgeously restored neo-Baroque palace, practically glowing with public funding and filled with music.
Right.
Then you look to your right, just down the block, and you see the Stoa Karapanagioti, a stunning 1920s Art Deco masterpiece that is rotting, boarded up, and sealed off by the Red Cross. Why does a city save one piece of history and let the other crumble into the pavement?
It is a painful visual contrast, but it rarely comes down to a lack of historical appreciation. It almost always comes down to the brutal realities of economics and property ownership.
So it's about the money.
The conservatory was a state-owned property. Before it was a music school, it housed the National Social Security Administration for decades. Because the state owns it, the state eventually has the bureaucratic apparatus and the public funding required to painstakingly restore it for public use.
But the Stoa Karapanagioti is private.
Exactly. Commercial buildings are victims of macroeconomic gravity. The Stoa was designed in 1925 for a very specific economic ecosystem: the bustling, dense, wholesale textile and fabric trade. When that specific industry modernized, collapsed, or moved to cheaper industrial parks on the outskirts of the city, the ecosystem inside the Stoa died.
So the building loses its purpose?
The owners, which in this case is an institution like the Red Cross, inherit a massive problem. They often do not have the millions of euros in capital required to safely retrofit a decaying 1920s commercial arcade.
Because you can't just slap a fresh coat of paint on it.
No, you have to update the plumbing, install modern electrical grids, and adhere to strict modern seismic building codes, all without damaging the protected historical aesthetics. It is wildly expensive to turn it into modern office space or a boutique hotel.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
So the building becomes trapped in a financial purgatory. It is protected by law from being demolished, but it is financially unviable to restore. So it just sits there, slowly degrading.
It's not a lack of love. It's a lack of leverage. Which brings us to the final reality of our deep dive. We've explored the Byzantine emperors, the anarchist tunnels, the WWII bombings, and the master architects. But what happens if you put on your shoes and walk down Leontos Sofou today on a Tuesday afternoon?
It's a whole new world.
The historical ghosts are clearly still there, locked in the architecture, but they share the sidewalk with a very lively, very modern, and sometimes struggling demographic.
The street today is an incredible study in vibrant friction. It's a highly active mix of elevated arts, intense student life, and completely unapologetic modern commercialism.
Let's start with the arts, because the sources gave us a really uplifting update regarding the conservatory.
It is a massive triumph for the city's cultural heritage. In March 2026, after 2 full years of extensive, highly technical, and painstaking restoration work spearheaded by the Ministry of Culture, the State Conservatory, officially reopened its doors at its historic home on Leontos Sofou.
How did the street react to that?
They celebrated 111 years of musical education by turning the street into a venue. The students and faculty hosted massive free concerts. They opened those grand doors and invited the general public inside to stand in the restored glass atrium.
That sounds magical.
The sound of orchestras flooded out onto the pavement. It injected a massive, palpable dose of cultural vitality right back into the street level.
That is the beautiful side of the street. But if you walk right across the street or just a few doors down, the reality is much harsher. The modern identity of Leontos Sofou is heavily defined by the presence of the 4th student dormitory of Aristotle University.
Aristotle University is a massive institution, and it has an extensive housing network to accommodate students coming from all over Greece. They took over the old Hotel Ignatia, located right on the street at Leontos Sofou number 11, to use as student housing.
That sounds like a great location for a student, though.
From a lifestyle perspective, yes, it places hundreds of students right in the beating commercial heart of the city, just steps away from the famous nightlife district of Oloratu.
But living inside a historical building isn't always romantic. If you look at the journalistic accounts in Parallaxy and the statements from the student unions, the daily living conditions inside those walls are a serious point of friction.
The contrast is stark. As we report impartially from the sources, the student unions and resident associations have heavily and consistently documented their grievances. They are living in an aging former hotel, and the infrastructure is simply failing under the weight of time and constant use.
Like what kind of issues?
The students frequently report severe infrastructural decay. We are talking about persistent, unhealthy mold in the rooms due to trapped humidity. There are documented reports of heavy chunks of plaster randomly falling from the ceilings in the common areas.
That is incredibly dangerous.
Furthermore, there is a highly vocal, urgent demand from the student body for the state to conduct comprehensive seismic structural checks on the building to ensure their basic safety. So while these students have the undeniable benefit of living in the center of the historical city, they are fighting a daily uphill battle against the very real decay of that history.
Think about the juxtaposition happening on this single 300-meter stretch of pavement. On one side of the street, you have a 19-year-old student putting a bucket under a leaky roof and dodging falling plaster in their dorm room.
Right.
On the exact opposite side of the street, a few yards away, a prodigy is playing a Mozart sonata on a grand piano in a gorgeously restored, state-funded, neo-Baroque glass atrium. And then you step onto the pavement between them, and you are entirely surrounded by the modern retail economy.
The romantic 19th century luxury hotels and the bustling wholesale textile merchants of the 1920s have largely been swept away by globalized convenience.
Replaced by what, exactly?
If you look at the ground-level retail today, the street features a little supermarket. There's a Starbucks, there's a McDonald's. You have modern car dealerships with bright fluorescent lights and mechanics loudly servicing modern vehicles.
Wow, quite a mix.
You even have basements converted into aggressive fitness spaces, with gyms specializing in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is a highly functional, entirely unsentimental, modern commercial strip.
Does this wild mix, the classical music floating over McDonald's, the struggling students living next to unrestored Art Deco arcades, does this friction define what a living city actually is, as opposed to a city that is just a museum?
I strongly believe so. A museum is highly curated, static, and safe. Everything is behind glass, beautifully lit, and perfectly explained. A living city is inherently messy. It's contradictory.
Yeah, that's a good word for it, contradictory.
It is constantly overriding itself, making mistakes and leaving things behind. The fact that a university student can buy a Frappuccino at a global coffee chain, walk past a heartbreakingly beautiful, abandoned 1925 Art Deco arcade, listen to an opera singer practicing inside a 19th century bank that survived a terrorist bombing, and then go to sleep in a decaying former luxury hotel. That friction is the absolute definition of urban vitality.
It's all just stacked on top of itself.
Leontos Sofou Street hasn't been frozen in time for the benefit of tourists. It has aggressively absorbed every single era of the last 2,000 years and kept moving forward.
It has survived empires collapsing. It survived massive demographic and linguistic shifts. It survived the Great Fire that wiped out half the city, anarchist tunnels packed with dynamite, Zeppelin bombings from the clouds, and the extreme crushing lows of modern economic busts. And through it all, it has retained this chaotic, beautiful, explosive identity.
It is a 300-meter stretch of road that demands you pay attention to it. It proves, without a doubt, that history isn't a straight, logical timeline printed in a textbook. It is a series of dense layers, sometimes violently compacted together, waiting for someone curious enough to stop, dig down, and read them.
And we hope we've helped you read a few of those layers today. Before we wrap up, we want to remind you once again that this deep dive was made possible by the fantastic project The Street Has Its Own Story, or O Dromos, echi diki historia, which was provided by the podcaster Giannis Stefanidis.
It's such an important project.
It really is. It's dedicated, highly localized research projects like his that keep the deep, hidden narratives of our urban spaces alive.
If there is one final lingering thought to take away from this entire exploration, it's a shift in how we perceive the daily environments we walk through. We are culturally conditioned to think of history as something safely locked away in the past. We think it lives in archives, or behind velvet ropes in a gallery.
Or in books.
Right, or in books. But as the 70 live, unexploded artillery shells found buried under a modern construction site on Leontos Sofou definitively prove, the past is literally buried right beneath our feet. It is completely invisible, entirely potent, and just waiting to be struck by a shovel.
That is a terrifying but awe-inspiring thought.
So tomorrow, when you walk down a completely ordinary, seemingly boring street in your own city on your way to work or the grocery store, look down at the asphalt and ask yourself, what invisible empires, what forgotten underground tunnels, or what dormant explosives are you casually stepping over?